Module 3, Ethical Scenarios and Dilemmas. Welcome back to the Introduction to Court Interpreter Ethics of the Supreme Court of Ohio. In Modules 1 and 2, you learned about the Model Code of Professional Responsibility for Interpreters in the Judiciary of the National Center for State Courts and the version of this code by the Supreme Court of Ohio. You learned about many situations in which interpreters and translators are required to conduct themselves in fulfillment of the canons or rules that comprise those codes. In this module, you will demonstrate your analytical ability by solving ethical dilemmas with case study exercises. The goal of this module is that you will be able to apply the Ohio Code of Professional Conduct to your work as court interpreters. As a court interpreter, you will encounter situations in which you will have to make a choice between two or more options. Only one may be the correct decision. The consequences of your decision, through your words, actions, or omissions, will affect everyone, including you, sooner or later. Picture yourself in the following situation. After a status hearing in a civil action case, you leave the courtroom and the plaintiff walks out with you. It is the third hearing you have been hired to interpret for this plaintiff in court. As you walk back to the office, the plaintiff catches up to you and asks you how you're doing and how the family is. You say, "I'm fine, and the family too, thank you." The plaintiff asks you about the upcoming religious holy day that you observe in your culture, and you reply something culturally appropriate. You ask the same in return because it's a culturally appropriate thing to do. After a couple more pleasantries and a farewell, you each go your merry way. Now, is this situation an example of a professional conduct? Is the interpreter's cultural behavior in line with his professional conduct as a court interpreter? Outside a courtroom, someone could have watched this exchange of words. Could they have formed an opinion about the interpreter as partial to the plaintiff? What canon of the code could the interpreter have not followed? Here is another situation. After the hearing in a contract disputes case was adjourned to be recalled after lunch, as the interpreter was leaving the courthouse, the defendant caught up with her and thanked her for her help interpreting so far and invited her to lunch. The interpreter could not decline the invitation because, among those in their shared culture, if one declined, it would be dishonorable. The lunch was great, and the defendant paid for it. After lunch, they returned to the courthouse to conclude the hearing. Now, what do you make of that behavior? Clearly, the interpreter was wrong to accept having lunch with the defendant. What should the interpreter have done to get out of this dilemma? Which canon of the Ohio Code did she disregard? Here is a more technical dilemma. During an evidentiary hearing in a divorce matter, the plaintiff's attorney was cross-examining the defendant. The attorney presented an exhibit, the marriage certificate. It was written in a non-English language. The judge instructed the interpreter to sight translate it for the record. After a brief review of the document, the interpreter began to sight translate it. Halfway through it, she paused and said, "And there are a couple of seals and text boxes on the right side." Then she continued on. Suddenly, the judge stopped her. "Madam Interpreter, sight translate those seals and boxes too." To which the interpreter replied, "But they are just some boxes. They're nothing, really." If you were the judge, what would you have thought about that answer? Did any canon just come to mind? Which one and why? What the judge did should come as no surprise. She sternly admonished the interpreter to orally translate the content of those seals and boxes for the record, and reminded the interpreter of her duty to provide a complete interpretation of the document. Needless to say, that interpreter was never called back again. You will come to know that interpreters work in teams of 2 or 3 at lengthy proceedings. They support each other by providing rest from fatigue after interpreting for 30 minutes or so nonstop. Also, while one of them is interpreting for the record, the other is taking notes, listening to ensure accuracy, and looking up words to support the other colleague. Well, suppose that interpreter John has just been relieved. John goes to the restroom and then goes outside for a while. He returns to the courtroom after about 20 minutes, only to find his colleague giving him an annoyed look. What could have gone wrong? Pause this audio and list possible problems that the colleague could have faced in John's absence. Well, for instance, the colleague was stumped by a word used by the witness. So when she tried to ask for clarification, the witness, not a well-educated person, could not give her an explanation for that word or an alternative word. Or the colleague started coughing uncontrollably for a couple of minutes, and the judge had to suspend the hearing. Or, as often happens when there are bilingual attorneys involved, an attorney objected to the colleague's interpretation of that word. Add to these your examples. Did John do anything wrong, counter to the Code of Ethics of Judiciary Interpreters? Which canon comes to mind? Let's look at another team interpreting situation. You are at the witness stand and finish rendering for the record the last utterance by the witness when you hear your colleague say aloud from the defense table, "Your Honor, that's not the correct term for that word. It is..." Is that the professional way to act on the record? To test your answer, let's say that interpreters must ensure that the record is accurate, complete, and faithful to the original. Did the interpreter do the right thing by correcting the colleague? Was it the right way to correct the colleague? Well, yes to the first question, but no to the second question. First of all, colleagues should sit close to each other. This way, if one has made a mistake, the other can quickly pass a note with a correction without calling undue attention to the interpreting work and the interpreters. Here is the last procedural scenario on how an interpreter acted. During a private, off-the-record exchange between an attorney and her client while they were reviewing a plea agreement in the criminal case, the defendant turned to the interpreter and asked him if he could clarify the conditions that he had just interpreted. The interpreter, looking at the attorney, informed her that her client had just asked the interpreter a question, so he was going to take a couple of seconds to rephrase a sentence that he had just finished interpreting so that the client could understand it. Question: did the interpreter do the right thing? Do you think that the interpreter is the one who should decide how to rephrase a statement or question so that others can understand it? Let's look at this more closely. First, what is the role of the interpreter? In this situation, did the interpreter maintain his role, or did he take on any other role? Where did that leave the attorney? What is the role of the attorney? Is it possible that the interpreter did not adhere to any canon of the code in particular? Make a note of that canon for future reference or discussion. This marks the end of the listening session for Module 3. Now, please turn to the exercises that are accessible with the link provided. You will also have a quiz to test your understanding of both the Code of Professional Responsibility for Interpreters in the Judiciary and the Code of Professional Conduct of the State of Ohio.